I've been looking forward to this video since you brought up the idea. I think you noticed some common questions I was getting just over the phone, as Anthony's often next to me when I'm on the phone or just at the track talking to riders. The common question for people is how to adjust their suspension.
Yes, a lot of customers, whether they be a JBI customer or a new customer, would often call JB or walk up to us at the track and say, hey, my bike is doing this. I think I need to do this to fix the problem. And a lot of times there's a lot of misconception or misunderstandings of what is a chassis change or what is a suspension change, or what your bike is doing based on your suspension setup or your chassis setup. And our mission at Ride JBI is to help differentiate between the two. So is it chassis or is it suspension? And furthermore than that, we're going to break down how to adjust your chassis or suspension based on your own rider feedback. We'll start with the more simpler one, in my opinion, which is a suspension change. I feel like it could be quite overcomplicated by many, but a suspension change is as simple as turning your compression clicker either in or out. It is pretty much just that.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, anything where you are tuning the shock absorber itself. So whether it be the rear shock or the forks, you can call them a front shock if you want. But anytime you're really manipulating that directly, you're adjusting the suspension. What's really fun about dirt bikes is not only do we get to ride them, but the amount of modification, tweaking, and tuning we can do as a rider. As kind of a gearhead, that's just something I've always really enjoyed. But that also adds to the complexity of it as well, because not only do you have a lot of options, but you have a lot of options to choose from.
Yep.
And what people are learning is while you can adjust one area of the bike, it may have a multiplied effect or a crossover effect in other areas. Have you ever forgot to check your tire pressure? Like say you just did your tires, so you got new tires on your bike, but you didn't air it down. Maybe it's at like at 20 PSI. And you ever gone riding and noticed how stiff your suspension feels?
All the time. Yeah, it's a common mistake. Sometimes, I mean, I have an air fork on my gas. I would check the air pressure and I'm like, well, why is it off? That's essentially your spring rate, so it should be pretty bang on the money every single time you ride. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, that just goes to show you that even though the tire's main job is giving you traction to the ground, that's your direct contact, that it can have a crossover effect if it's set up so poorly or so out of spec. And in this video, that's what we really want to touch on, is when you have a crossover effect, when you don't, and when to know which part to adjust. So with that in mind, man, I mean, I know some of the common calls we get, people ask us, hey, the bike was doing this, and they usually are very inclined to make a suspension change first instead of a chassis adjustment for it. So in my eyes, the suspension, meaning the shock and the forks, its key job is absorbing the bumps and the irregularities in the ground, and also absorb jump landings. The chassis, so think geometry of how tall the bike sits, whether it's, you know, been lowered with a different link so it sits lower in the rear, or you slid the forks down or up in their triple clamps, that's going to have much more of an effect on the handling of the motorcycle. Adjusting that will have very little, if any, influence over how the bike feels going over bumps, meaning how it absorbs or doesn't absorb the bumps. Now, keep in mind, there is that crossover effect. So what are some things that come to your mind in terms of like what you can adjust and what it will do, but what it may also affect elsewhere?
A lot of people will say, oh, I get head shake on straight line stability. I'm at Glen Helen, there's a wide open straightaway, my bike wants a head shake. I want to speed up my rebound so my front wheel can follow the ground a little bit more. Well, how high or low are your forks pushed up through your triple clamps?
For sure.
Because one of the things is, just a general rule of thumb for you guys out there is, if your are pushed up through your clamps, you're going to cause more instability. On the flip side of that, when you enter into a rut, your bike's going to want to lay into that rut, maybe a little bit better than normal, or it might want to even oversteer and want to knife into that rut. And the opposite effect when you drop your forks into the triple clamps, you might gain some more straight line stability, but you're also going to lose some cornering ability. So that's another good example of a chassis change versus a suspension change. Again, suspension change would be like your clickers, or even like your spring rates, or even like your oil volumes like in your fork.
Yep.
Whereas a chassis change would be like your fork height, rider sag. How far in or out your chain adjuster bolts are is another good one. Rider sag is very crucial when cornering the bike. And a lot of people might say, hey, I want to get my sag to a 104 or a 105. Very dependent upon rider. I mean, we talk about it all the time, whether it's their inseam length or whether it's how tall they are or their weight. A lot of that comes from people having a preconceived notion of, hey, I need to have my sag at this. At Ride JBI, we typically have a window, if we like to call, of preferable rider sag. And again, that's based upon the brand, make, model, year of bike that you have, your inseam, your height, and so on and so forth. There's a couple other factors that go into that, which we will go into greater detail in another video, because this will be a multi-part series.
Yeah, good job on pointing out the uniqueness of each rider that's out there. We all have different builds in terms of how tall we are, how much we weigh, and also riding styles, how we ride the bike. So it's awesome we have great magazines and testers out there that go out and test stock bikes, and they provide their feedback, and they give you some really good baseline settings. I think what's important to keep in mind is that by no means are those values absolute. Meaning if somebody says, hey, 105 is a sag, likely that doesn't apply to everybody. It's a great starting point. But it's important to keep in mind that if that's best for that test rider, and if you're maybe a different build, then you might find a sag number that's a little different than that, that's best for you. And I can understand the challenge of that part, because if you don't have somebody there next to you, somebody like maybe like me, a suspension guy, to give you the confidence of going, hey man, like you're right, you do want to tweak this. I can understand the hesitation to want to adjust something based on what you read from a very good, trustworthy source. Again, excellent place to start, but it's great to know how to further custom tune your bike to your specific needs. The tire was a good example on the kind of the crossover effect. So what I commonly get is people will call and say, hey, I was riding today and I was having a hard time catching this inside rut. I want to slow down the rebound. Rich gang. I understand why some riders think that. They think, hey, I'm going to slow the rebound, the bike will ride a little bit lower, and you can do that. That will certainly help that scenario. But again, if the feedback is, hey, my bike's having a hard time doing a turn, that's more of a chassis setup. So I'd say before we start adjusting suspension clickers, let's first start closest to the source. So that's first going to be tire selection. And usually that goes pretty quick, meaning the individuals say, I like my tires. They're Dunlop these or the Bridgestone these, where people tend to have their preferred tire. So we can quickly kind of rule that out as, okay. So the next we want to look at, how high are your triple clamps in the forks? What's your sag? Like, let's look at other items that are closer to the source, meaning what has the biggest influence over the handling of the bike before we get farther away. I understand why people are often likely to jump to those things because it's easiest and quickest to them. I see that a lot with engine hangers and frame mounts. I think that's an awesome tuning aspect to have for bikes, but I feel like sometimes they get applied too often for scenarios that the bike could be better improved with suspension for it. But I think a lot of it has to do with just riders' resources at the track and what they can do. I mean, when we go ride a bike, we can test it. We feel what it feels like in stock form, but we know we're going to take apart the suspension, revalve it, and tune it before we get more complex, I want to say, and start modifying the chassis. And by that, I mean not necessarily fork height and tube height, but starting to change rigidity, flexiness in areas like that, or different torques. All stuff of value, but I think as you do that, you're adding a lot more complexity to your setup. And it's harder to measure, is what I changed doing exactly what I thought it did.
We will dive into this and dissect this even further. This will be a multi-part video. The next video will be how to tune your suspension based on your own rider feedback and when to adjust your suspension based on your own rider feedback. And then the third part will be how to adjust your chassis based on your own rider feedback and when to adjust your chassis based on your own rider feedback. So we hope that you guys follow along throughout this multi-part series and really understand and get a better grasp of how to adjust your chassis, how to adjust your suspension, and hopefully pass it on to your riding buddies who may be struggling with rider setup, because it's quite often that we come across someone who's having a bad day because of their bike setup, which is unfortunate. You know, riding your bike should be fun, and when you go to the track, you want your bike to be dialed in, you want to be having fun. And unfortunately, this is not the case all the time. So if we could help spread the knowledge that we have gained and learned over the many years of testing and tuning and just being a sponge, and we try to spread it through you guys through Instagram, YouTube, and ridejba.com. So stay tuned. We have plenty more in the works. Anything you want to touch on before we wrap up?
Yeah, just quickly that I think the main takeaway I like for you guys is there's not so much going to be an absolute answer we can give you. I wish there was. I wish there was a way we could say, put your clickers here, do your sag here, and every single rider is going to love that setting. I think the main takeaway is we hope we can educate you guys, have a better understanding of what options you have to tune, when to tune them, why to tune them, maybe how much to adjust them. So that way you can better understand that there is no absolute answers, but you can absolutely understand this and then apply your understanding to how to adjust your bike for it. Because what you're going to find is there's a lot of ways to solve the same issue, but typically there's an optimal way to solve the issue. And what we're learning, or have learned, is you always want to start as close to the source of the issue as possible, and you work your way back from there. Anthony did a great job talking about stability or instability at Glen Helen and making chassis adjustments, and that's exactly where you'd want to start. If for some reason you were to rule out all the chassis adjustments and find, all right, the chassis is where we want it to be, yes, then now start adjusting clickers for it as well. So what you see is, unfortunately, in the sense of the complexity of it, there isn't always an easy answer. A lot of it requires testing, trying one setting, going back to your base setting to verify, is it better, is it worse, or is it just different? You learn from all of those, but ideally you only want it if it's better. So this is going to be fun, further explaining to you guys how to tune your bike, and we hope it to be more in-depth and informative than a lot of other videos out there. A good way you can help us is please leave us comments if you have any specific riding situations, scenarios, or setups that come to mind. Even if you want it specific to you, like leave the info in there and say, hey, I ride this bike, here's how tall I am, what do you recommend? We'll give you a quick couple minutes in the video sharing what we think would be a good starting point or how to help you resolve any issues that you're having.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for part 1 of chassis versus suspension. Again, we'll have a part 2 and a part 3 breaking down suspension and chassis individually. And then maybe even do a part 4, a recap summary of it again, kind of like what we did for part 1. But thank you guys for watching, and we will see you guys in the next one.